In our New Testament reading, we skip 12 chapters almost to arrive at this strange story that has echoes of the story that Sheldon read for you earlier. It's called the story of the Transfiguration, beginning at chapter 17, verse 1. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. And his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome with fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself, alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." Holy wisdom, holy word. Thanks be to God. What is this? What is happening in this morning's gospel story? What does it mean for us, and where does it lead us? We have fast-forwarded past the middle of Matthew's gospel, jumping from chapter 5 to chapter 17. We make a jump like this once every year as the season of Epiphany comes to a close and the season of Lent approaches. It seems we need a Sunday to act as a hinge for us between these 2 great and important and beautiful seasons of the church's life. One season is Epiphany, the season of the light of Christ shining for us, the stories of his baptism and early ministry still bathed in the glow of a shining star. The other season is Lent, when we join Jesus on a 6-week-long journey toward the cross. During Lent, everything Jesus says and does is seen in the light of that journey, of that cross. So we need a hinge Sunday, a step away from Epiphany and a step towards Lent, which begins this Wednesday. This is that Sunday, and it is good to be here. It's 6 days later, but we've skipped so many chapters, we don't know what that means. If we look back at chapter 16, however, we get it. Last thing that happened before this, 6 days ago, Jesus posed an awkward question to his disciples. "Who do people say that I am?" At this point, the listeners to this gospel might expect to hear someone say, "He's the new Moses," because Matthew has been making that case very carefully. But that's not what happens. They say, "John the Baptist," some say Elijah. But when Jesus asks, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter steps up to the mic and says, "You are most definitely 100% the Messiah." And then he and Jesus have a moment. And it's pretty great until it's not. Jesus then turns things right on their head by saying, "I sure am, but don't forget this next part." And to their shock and dismay, he foretells his death and his resurrection. Peter isn't having it. it is clear this is not Peter's idea of what a Messiah is. A Messiah, as far as he can recognize from the scriptures, is someone who's sometimes a general or a judge or a king, but always someone who leads the people to victory. Jesus, who only recently was having a tender moment of connection with Peter, says, "Get behind me, Satan," by which he means, since Hasatan is Hebrew for the tempter, I think it's fair to assume that Jesus is asking, demanding, that Peter not try to tempt him to abandon what he knows he must do. Now it is 6 days later. This is the next thing that happens in the gospel. Jesus is taking 3 of his disciples to climb a mountain. One of the 3 is Peter. And immediately Jesus is transfigured in front of them. Now raise your hand if the first time you ever heard the word transfiguration was in Professor McGonagall's class. This is different. The good professor might have you turn a teacup into a bird, into another very different thing. That's the Wizard World definition of transfiguration. But about Jesus, Matthew writes, his face shone like the sun and became dazzling white. So he was changed in a startling way, probably a frightening way. But he was still Jesus. Something else happens along with this transfiguration, and it's every bit as important as the changes to Jesus' appearance. 2 figures show up, 2 people arrive, immediately recognizable to the disciples as Moses and Elijah. I can only assume because they were dressed or carrying things that marked them as being those 2 people. Maybe Moses had the tablets of the law in his arms. Maybe Elijah was dressed in camel's hair, just like we know John the Baptist dressed too. And generally at this point in the sermon, I would say, and Moses symbolizes the law, and Elijah symbolizes the prophets, and then I would move on. And that is certainly true. They do. But this year, I'm taken with other connections between Jesus and Moses and Elijah. These 2 figures who abide with him in his transfigured state. Matthew is already making a lot of connections for us between Moses and Jesus. Again, here we are on a mountain, and we're with the one who got the tablets of the law from God on Mount Sinai. And the passage Sheldon just read for us describes a close encounter with God in which the glory of the Lord is described as a devouring fire. When Moses comes down from that mountain a few chapters later, he is physically transfigured. His face is so radiant that people are terrified to go near him, to even look at him. I can't help thinking of the word my professor used of Hebrew scriptures, David Carr, when I was in seminary, to describe the holiness of God. He used the word radioactive, powerful, and terrifying in that power. As for Elijah, the people have already connected Jesus with Elijah. Elijah was a powerful speaker, anointed with the Spirit of God. He performed healing miracles. He even performed loaves and fishes type miracles, making oil or meal last and last, alleviating poverty and starvation while he was at it. There's another fascinating thing that connects Jesus and Moses and Elijah: their deaths. Moses has a very strange death. We assume that Moses died, but oddly, that death is never described in Scripture, and Scripture self-consciously makes it known that no one knows where or when Moses died. And Jewish tradition has it that God actually, since there was no one with him, God buried Moses with God's own hands. Elijah has a kind of non-death death. Scripture describes him as being taken up and away in a fiery chariot. And Jesus? Well, you know how weird his death story is. Peter and the other disciples try to take it in, and Peter offers a grateful response for something that's probably beyond anybody's ability to comprehend. It's good for us to be here, he says. And let's just rest with that for a moment. It is good to be in the presence of three of God's outstanding servants, certainly. But more than that, in this moment, past, present, and future stand together and have a conversation. Moses and Elijah not only represent the law and the prophets, but also the very foundations of everything Jesus is about. Jesus calls God's people not just to faith, but to faithfulness, to walk in God's blessed path of doing justice and loving mercy and walking humbly with God. And if there's anything Moses and Elijah know how to do, it's take a journey. One of them led people on a long and winding road from slavery to freedom that took about 40 years. The other sought to free the people from the corruption of their own leaders and paid for it with a life on the lamb. It is good to be here, to be reminded not just of the long history of life in relationship with God, but also of the unique and colorful characters who have walked that path before us and who walk it now alongside us, and even who lead us into a future we can't yet see and don't yet understand. It is good to be here, Peter says. And that's good news because Peter may well be that person who needs most to have this experience on the mountain. The guy who the last he spoke up about it was invested in a kind of Messiah that Jesus made it plain he is not. It's good to be here, Peter says, and then offers to make some accommodations for their guests, some tents, a lovely gesture of hospitality, perhaps. But God's answer to that is to roll right over what he's saying with a bright cloud, overshadowing Jesus and Moses and Elijah and everyone on that mountain. And now, seeing nothing at all, the disciples have no choice but to listen. This is my Son, my beloved, the one with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. God might as well say, I'm speaking to you, Peter. He and the others fall to the ground. The dazzling sight of Jesus and Moses and Elijah delights them and makes them wonder, but the voice of the Almighty scares them half out of their wits. But Jesus goes to them and touches them and tells them, get up. Do not be afraid. This story is told in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but each time it's told in a slightly different way. Here in Matthew's Gospel, this is the only time that Jesus responds to the terror of his friends like this. This is the only time he walks over to them and touches them and says, it's okay. It's all right. Get up now. No need to be afraid. What does this story mean for us, though? I think we're quick to focus on one aspect of this episode above the others, the vision, the astounding revelation that everyone received. They received the gift of seeing the truth of Jesus. Eastern Orthodox theologians call this radiance uncreated light. Uncreated light. They say it's the same light that Paul saw in the moment of his conversion on the road to Damascus. They say it's the same light that Moses saw emanating from the burning bush. They say this light is associated with God's pure presence. I don't completely understand this concept. I only learned about it this week. But it must have been beyond anything we can imagine. And it may not be the point of this story at all, or maybe it is there in service to a larger point, a point that does matter to us today, right now. Jesus is Messiah in exactly the way God has anointed him to be. Jesus is Messiah, and that means that he will walk a path that leads to suffering and death, and then resurrection. That's why we can't understand this episode without understanding the controversy before it. Peter pushing back against Jesus' self-understanding and Jesus pushing back even harder. Here, God speaks and settles the matter once and for all. Listen, God says. Listen to him. So on this Hinge Sunday, we have a vision of Jesus that echoes the themes of Epiphany, the glory of the angels singing at Jesus' birth, the brightness of the star that led the wise ones to him, the voice of God at his baptism declaring him beloved, even the 0 to 60 start of his ministry when he began teaching and feeding and healing God's people like crazy. Jesus shines. And simultaneously, we have a vision of what's to come, a path that is not easy, a wilderness journey that begins with temptation and is filled with controversy and leads not to a political or military victory, but to death. And yes, we know what happens then, but there's no shortcut to resurrection. Where does this story lead us? Among other things, it leads us into the journey of Lent. It helps the sign of the ashes make more sense, a sign of our human limitations and frailty, our finiteness, but also a reminder that, like these disciples, we don't take this journey alone. We are not supposed to go it alone. God has given us companions for this journey. Others with whom we can travel and climb and rest and eat and get up again. God has given us friends who will say to us, get up now. Don't be afraid. God has given us companions for walking God's blessed path of doing justice and loving mercy and walking humbly with God. And it is good to be here. Thanks be to God. Amen.